Chapter 15. A Discovery. It was just after tea that the Bentley came up the drive of Merroway Court, a young and correct chauffeur at the wheel. Frankie went out to the front door. Sylvia and Roger came with her. "Is everything all right, Hawkins?" The chauffeur, who was, of course, Bobby in disguise, complete with moustache, touched his cap respectfully.
"Yes, m'lady. The Bentley's been completely repaired."
He produced a note.
"From his lordship, m'lady."
Frankie took it. "You will stay at the Angler's Arms in Staveley, Hawkins. I'll telephone in the morning."
"Very good, your ladyship."
Bobby turned and drove quickly down the drive. "It's a lovely car," said Sylvia.
"You get some speed out of that," said Roger.
"I do," admitted Frankie. She was satisfied that Roger hadn't recognized Bobby. She would have been surprised if he had. The uniform, the moustache, and the formal behavior, so uncharacteristic of Bobby, made him a very different man from the one Roger had met beside the body on the cliffside. The voice, too, had been excellent. Meanwhile, Bobby had settled into his room at the Angler's Arms and successfully created the part of Edward Hawkins, chauffeur to Lady Frances Derwent. Bobby knew nothing of the behaviour of chauffeurs in private life, but he imagined that an amount of superiority would be right. The young women employed at the Angler's Arms quickly showed that they clearly admired him, which made him feel he was doing well in his disguise. And he soon found that Frankie and her accident had provided the main topic of conversation in Staveley ever since it had happened. Frankie's letter had asked Bobby to get any local information he could, so he spoke to the pub landlord, a round, friendly person called Thomas Askew.
"Very nice little place you have here, Mr. Askew,"
said Bobby, managing to be both superior and kindly.
"Very nice and comfortable."
Mr. Askew looked pleased.
"Is Merroway Court the only big place in the neighbourhood?" "Well, there's the Grange, Mr. Hawkins. It has been empty for years, until this American doctor took it. Nicholson, his name is. And if you ask me, Mr. Hawkins, there are some very strange things happening there."
The barmaid at this point remarked that Dr. Nicholson frightened her a bit.
"What strange things, Mr. Askew?"
said Bobby. Mr. Askew shook his head sadly.
"Many of the patients there don't want to be. They've been put into the Grange by their relations, and they can't get out without their relations' permission. I assure you, Mr. Hawkins, you wouldn't believe the screams and groans that go on there."
Here the barmaid joined in eagerly. "Why, one night a poor young woman escaped, in her nightgown she was, and the doctor and a couple of nurses were out looking for her. 'Oh, don't let them take me back,' she was crying out. It was so sad. She said that she was rich and that her relations had put her away. But the people at the Grange took her back, they did, and the doctor explained she'd got a persecution mania, meaning she thought everyone was against her. But I've often wondered if what she said was true, and there's no way of knowing how the patients at the Grange are really treated." Bobby listened to all this with great interest, and then said he was going for a walk before going to bed. The Grange was, he knew, on the other side of the village from Merroway Court, so he turned in that direction. A lot of what he had heard could, of course, be explained. If Nicholson ran a place for curing drug takers, there would be strange sounds coming from it. But all the same, the story of the escaping girl worried Bobby. At this point in his thoughts, Bobby arrived at a high wall with an entrance of metal gates, which were locked. He moved farther along the road, measuring the wall with his eye. Would it be possible to climb over? Suddenly, he came across a little door. To his surprise, it was not locked. Bit of a mistake here, thought Bobby with a grin. He slipped through and found himself on a path, which twisted through bushes. Without warning, at a sharp turn, the path ended when it came to an open space close to the house, and Bobby stepped full into the moonlight before he could stop himself. At that moment, a woman came round the corner of the house. She was walking very softly, glancing from side to side with, or so it seemed to Bobby, the fear of someone being hunted. Suddenly, she stopped completely still and stood, moving from side to side as though she would fall. Bobby rushed forward and caught her. Her lips were white. He had never seen such awful fear on any human face before. "It's all right," he said reassuringly, in a very low voice. The girl moaned faintly, her eyelids half closed. "I'm so frightened," she whispered. "I'm so terribly frightened." "What's the matter?" said Bobby. Suddenly, she seemed to hear something. She moved quickly away from Bobby. "Go away," she said. "I want to help you," said Bobby. "Do you?" She looked at him, a strange, searching look. Then she shook her head. "No one can help me." "I can," said Bobby. "Tell me what it is that frightens you so." She shook her head. "Not now. Oh, quick! They're coming! You can't help me unless you go now. At once! At once!" Bobby gave in to her urgency. With a whispered, "I'm at the Angler's Arms," he ran back along the path. Suddenly, he heard footsteps on the path in front of him. Bobby stepped back quickly into the bushes, just before a man passed, but it was too dark to see his face. When he was sure the man was far enough away, Bobby got onto the path again, still trying to get over his shock at meeting the frightened girl. For he had recognized her beyond any possible doubt. She was the young woman in the photograph, which had so mysteriously disappeared. Chapter 16. Bobby becomes a lawyer. "It's extremely annoying," Frankie said, "to have to go up to London today, but the letter that Hawkins brought from Father yesterday says I must." "But," said Roger, who had come out to say goodbye to her as she left Merroway Court, "you'll be coming back this evening, won't you?" He took her hand and held it between his hands. "You are coming back," he said with strange firmness. Frankie laughed. "Of course I am." Bobby, who was holding the car door open for her to get into the front passenger seat, touched his cap respectfully, then got in himself and drove off. "Frankie," he said, "I found the girl who was in the photograph I found in the dead man's pocket." "Oh, Bobby, where?" "In Dr. Nicholson's nursing home." Bobby described what had happened the night before. "Then we are on the right track," Frankie said. "And Dr. Nicholson is mixed up in all this. I'm afraid of that man." "What's he like?" "Oh, big, and he has a powerful personality. And he watched me so closely that I felt he knew the truth about me." She described the dinner party and Dr. Nicholson's questions about her accident. "I think he was suspicious," she finished. "It's certainly strange that he went into details like that. But have you any idea now what's going on, Frankie?" "Well, I think that Dr. Nicholson's nursing home would be a very good cover-up for illegal drug dealing. He might be pretending to cure drug addicts when he's really supplying them with the stuff." "That's possible," agreed Bobby. "And I haven't told you yet about Henry Bassington French," said Frankie. Bobby listened to her description of Henry's strange behaviour.
And what about Roger Bassington French? He asked.
There I'm puzzled, said Frankie. I have a strange feeling that he's innocent.
No, said Bobby, he can't be. No one else could have exchanged the photographs.
I know, said Frankie, but perhaps there's an innocent explanation.
I don't see that there can be. If we only had some idea who the dead man really was.
Oh, but I have, Bobby. I'm almost sure he was a man called Alan Carstairs. Once more she told him everything she'd found out.
You know, said Bobby, we really are learning things. Now, we'll assume that you are right about Alan Carstairs. From what you say, he's lived abroad most of his adult life. He had very few friends in England, and if he disappeared, he wasn't likely to be missed. So, Carstairs comes down to Staveley with the Rivingtons. Now, did he get them to bring him deliberately, or was it just chance? And did he then come across the girl by accident just as I did? But he must have known her, or he wouldn't have had her photograph on him.
Or, said Frankie thoughtfully, he was already on the track of Nicholson and his gang for some reason.
And used the Rivingtons to get to Staveley.
That's a possible theory, said Frankie.
Or he may have been on the track of the girl, said Bobby. Maybe he knew her. She may have been kidnapped, and he came to England to find her.
But if he had tracked her down to Staveley, why would he go off to Wales? Asked Frankie.
Obviously there's a lot we don't know yet, said Bobby.
Evans, for example, said Frankie thoughtfully. We don't have any clues yet about Evans, so that part of it must be connected with Wales.
Frankie suddenly realised where they were.
Bobby, we've reached London. Where are we going, and what are we doing here?
That's for you to say, said Bobby. I don't even know why we've come up to town.
The journey to London was only an excuse so that I could talk with you privately. I couldn't risk being seen walking about at Staveley talking to my chauffeur. I used the letter that we pretended had come from Father as an excuse for driving up to town. Well, I think we'd better go to my house in Brook Street. Your garage may be watched.
Bobby, who lived in some rooms over the garage, agreed. At Brook Street, they went upstairs to the big drawing room.
There's one other thing, said Frankie. On the day you were poisoned, Roger Bassington French was at Staveley, but according to him, Nicholson was away at a conference in London.
And he has access to morphia, said Bobby. It fits in nicely. Frankie picked up a telephone directory. What are you going to do? Bobby asked.
I'm looking up the name Rivington. There's a few of them, but I think the Colonel Rivington, who lives in Onslow Square, or Mr. R. Rivington in Tite Street, are the most likely ones. The Rivingtons, Bobby, have got to be seen immediately.
But what are we going to say? Frankie thought, then said,
Do you feel you could be a lawyer?
But lawyers never make personal visits, do they? Surely they write and ask someone to come and see them at their office.
This firm does things differently, said Frankie.
She left the room and returned with a card.
Mr. Frederick Spragg, she said, handing it to Bobby. You are a member of the firm of Spragg, Jenkinson and Spragg, their father's lawyers. The only Spragg left there is about 100, and he adores me. I'll fix things with him if the Rivingtons discover you're not a solicitor.
What about clothes? I can't go in my chauffeur's uniform.
We'd better attack Father's wardrobe.
A quarter of an hour later, Bobby stood looking at himself in Lord Marchington's mirror. With these expensive clothes on me, I feel much more confident. Now then, Frankie, do you think your father could lend me a hat? Chapter 17.
Mrs. Rivington Talks. Colonel Rivington was out. Mrs. Rivington, however, was at home. Bobby was shown into a beautifully and expensively furnished drawing room and shook hands with Mrs. Rivington, who was beautifully and expensively dressed.
"I must apologize for coming to see you without warning, Mrs. Rivington," said Bobby, "but the matter is urgent. It's about our client, Mr. Alan Carstairs," he said. "He may have mentioned that we were working for him."
"I believe he did," said Mrs. Rivington. She was clearly the type of woman who would agree to something rather than admit she didn't know about it, a woman with more beauty than brains.
"About Mr. Carstairs," said Bobby.
"We haven't seen him for some time, about a month."
"When you took him down to Staveley?"
"Yes. He'd just arrived in London, and we were going down to Meroway Court for lunch, and up to Scotland next day for a couple of weeks, and Hubert really wanted to see Carstairs because he likes him so much, and so I said, 'My dear, let's take him down to the Bassington Frenches with us. They won't mind.' And we did. And of course, they didn't mind." She came breathlessly to a pause.
"Did he tell you his reasons for being in England?" asked Bobby.
"Oh, it was because of that millionaire, Savage, who was a friend of his. Savage's doctor told him he had cancer, and he killed himself. So sad."
"And did Mr. Carstairs know the Bassington Frenches?"
"Oh, no, but I think he liked them, though he was very quiet on the way back to London. I think something had upset him."
"You don't know what it was? Did he meet any of the neighbours, perhaps?"
"No, unless he did so when he went out for a walk after lunch. But he did ask a lot of questions about some people who lived near the Bassington Frenches, some doctor."
"Dr. Nicholson?"
"Yes. Alan wanted to know all about him and his wife. It seemed strange when he didn't know them. But what is it you wanted to know about Mr. Carstairs?"
"I really wanted his address," said Bobby. "We've just had an important telegram from New York and need his instructions, but he hasn't left an address. And having heard him talk about you, I thought you might have news of him."
"Oh, I see," said Mrs. Rivington. "Well, I am very sorry, but I have no idea where he's staying now."
"I do apologize for taking up so much of your time," said Bobby, getting up.
Back in Brook Street, he and Frankie talked about what they had now learnt.
"It looks as though chance took Carstairs to the Bassington Frenches," said Frankie. "So it's Nicholson who is at the heart of the mystery."
"Do you still insist that Roger Bassington French is innocent?" Bobby asked coldly.
"I can't believe he is a criminal."
"You can't deny the evidence that he changed the photograph."
"Damn the photograph," said Frankie.
Bobby drove up to Meroway Court in silence. Frankie got out of the car and went into the house without looking back. She opened the door of the library and stopped. Dr. Nicholson was sitting on the sofa, holding Sylvia Bassington French's hands. Sylvia jumped to her feet and came across to Frankie. "He's been telling me about Henry's drug addiction," she was crying. "It's terrible." And she ran out of the room. Dr. Nicholson had got up. His eyes, watchful as always, met Frankie's.
"Poor lady,"
he said.
"It has been a great shock, but it is best that she knows the truth. I want her to persuade her husband to become a patient at my nursing home."
Chapter 18. The Girl of the Photograph. On Bobby's return to the Angler's Arms, he was told that someone was waiting to see him.
"It's a lady. You'll find her in the little sitting room."
Wondering who it could be, Bobby went into the room. Sitting on a chair was a slim figure dressed in black,
the girl of the photograph. Her hands were shaking, and her large eyes held a terrified question. You said you'd help me."
"Of course I'll help you," Bobby said. "Don't be frightened. You're quite safe now."
"Who are you?" she asked. You're not really a chauffeur, are you?"
"No, but that doesn't matter now. Trust me, and tell me all about it."
"You must think I'm completely mad."
No.
"Yes, coming here like this. But I was so frightened." Bobby took her hand firmly.
"Look here, everything's going to be all right. You're safe now."
"When you stepped out into the moonlight the other night," she said, "it was like a dream, and I decided later that I would come and find you, and tell you everything. But you'll think I've gone mad from being in that place with those truly mad people."
"No, I won't. Please, tell me."
She stared straight in front of her. "I'm afraid I'm going to be murdered."
"Murdered?" Bobby exclaimed. "Who wants to murder you?"
"My husband."
"Your husband? Who are you?" he asked. "And who is your husband?"
It was her turn to look surprised. "Don't you know? I'm Moira Nicholson. My husband is Dr. Nicholson."
"And you're telling me your husband wants to murder you?"
"Yes. Strange things have happened to me. Accidents."
"Accidents?" said Bobby sharply.
"Yes. Oh, I know it sounds mad, but he reversed the car, not seeing I was there, he said later. I managed to jump aside, and there were some pills that were in the wrong bottle. It's exhausting me watching out for myself all the time, trying to save my life."
"Why does your husband want to kill you?" asked Bobby.
"Because he wants to marry Sylvia Bassington French. He's trying to get Mr. Bassington French to come to the Grange as a patient. Then something would happen to him there, I'm sure." She shivered. "He's got some power over Mr. Bassington French, but I don't know what it is."
"Bassington French takes morphia," said Bobby.
"Is that it? Jasper gives it to him, I suppose."
"It comes by post."
"Jasper's as cunning as a fox. If he posts the drugs to Henry Bassington French, no one will know they're from him." She shivered. "All sorts of things happen at the Grange. People come there to get better, and they don't. They get worse."
Bobby said, "You say your husband wants to marry Mrs. Bassington French."
Moira nodded. "He's crazy about her."
"And she?"
"I don't know," said Moira slowly. "She seems to be a simple woman, fond of her husband and little boy. But sometimes I've wondered if she is an entirely different woman from the one we all think she is. If she isn't playing a part."
"What about the brother, Roger?" asked Bobby.
"I don't know much about him. He's nice, I think, but he's completely fooled by Jasper." Bobby was silent a minute or two, trying to decide what to do.
"Look here," he said. "I'm going to ask you a question straight out. Did you know a man called Alan Carstairs, and at some time give him your photograph?"
He saw her cheeks go red. "Yes."
"Has he been down here to see you since you were married?"
"Yes. I don't know how he knew I was living here. I had never written to him since my marriage."
"But he found out and came. About a month ago?"
"Yes."
"Did you tell Carstairs your fears about your husband and the nursing home?"
She shook her head. "I tried not to show in any way that my marriage hadn't been a success."
"But he might have guessed it all the same."
said Bobby gently.
I suppose he might, she admitted in a low voice.
Do you think that he knew anything about your husband? That he suspected, for instance, that this nursing home place mightn't be quite what it seemed to be?
It's possible, she said at last. He asked one or two strange questions. But no, I don't think he can really have known anything about it.
Bobby was silent again for a few minutes. Then he said, "Would you call your husband a jealous man? Jealous, for instance, about you?"
Yes, very. He thinks he owns me, you see?
She shivered again. Then she asked suddenly,
You're not connected with the police, are you?
Oh, no.
I wondered, I mean...
Bobby looked down at his chauffeur's uniform.
It's a long story.
You are Lady Frances Derwent's chauffeur, aren't you? So the owner of the pub here said. I met her at dinner the other night.
I know. He paused. We've got to have a conversation with Frankie to discuss things. Do you think you could ring up and get her to meet you somewhere? I know it must seem really strange to you that I can't do it, but it won't be when I've explained.
Moira stood.
Very well.
At the door she stopped.
Alan, she said, Alan Carstairs. Did you say you'd seen him?
And, Bobby thought, shocked, she doesn't know he's dead. He said,
Ring up Lady Frances. Then I'll tell you everything.
Chapter 19. A Meeting of Three. Moira came back a few minutes later.
I've asked her to meet me at a place where we can sit near the river, she said.
While they waited for Frankie, Bobby felt he must try and explain everything that had happened.
There's a lot to tell you, he said. To begin with, I'm not a chauffeur, and my name isn't Hawkins. It's Jones. Bobby Jones. I come from Marchbolt in Wales.
Clearly Marchbolt meant nothing to her. Bobby went bravely to the terrible news he had to tell her.
I'm afraid I'm going to give you rather a shock. This friend of yours, Alan Carstairs, he's dead.
To his surprise, she looked sad, but that was all.
He fell over the cliff at Marchbolt, Bobby said. He had your photograph in his pocket.
Did he?
She gave a sweet, sad smile.
Dear Alan, he was very loyal.
Did he tell you he was going to Wales?
She shook her head.
You don't know anyone called Evans, do you? Said Bobby.
Evans? No. It's a very common name, of course, but I can't remember anybody. What is he?
That's just what we don't know. Oh, here's Frankie.
Frankie came hurrying along the path.
Hello, Frankie, said Bobby. We've got to have a serious talk. To begin with, it's Mrs. Nicholson who is the original of the photograph.
Oh, said Frankie. She looked at Moira and suddenly laughed. My dear, she said to Bobby, now I see why the sight of Mrs. Cayman was such a shock to you.
Exactly, said Bobby.
Moira was looking confused. Let me explain, Frankie said. She went straight into the story. But once she had explained their conclusion, that Bassington French must have pushed Carstairs over the cliff, she was brought to a stop by the look on Moira's face.
Roger Bassington French?
Moira's voice was amused. Your photograph disappeared, and only he could have taken it.
I see,
said Moira thoughtfully.
Facts are facts, said Bobby.
No.
Moira shook her head.
Roger might be weak or wild, but pushing someone over a cliff, No, I can't imagine it.
But he must have taken that photograph, said Bobby.
Yes, it seems very strange.
Moira paused for a moment, and then said unexpectedly,
Why don't you ask him?
Chapter 20. Meeting of Two. For a moment, the simplicity of the question took their breath away.
You see, said Moira, Roger must have taken that photograph, but I don't believe he pushed Alan over. Why should he? They had only met once, at lunch down here. There's no motive.
Then who did push him over? Asked Frankie directly.
Moira, said Bobby, do you mind if I tell Frankie what you're afraid of?
Moira turned her head away. If you like. But I can't believe it myself at this minute. I feel I've been terribly silly. Please don't pay any attention to what I said, Mr. Jones. It was just nerves. I must go now. Goodbye.
Bobby jumped up to follow her, but Frankie pushed him back. Stay there. Leave this to me.
She went quickly off after Moira. She returned a few minutes later. Well? Asked Bobby anxiously.
I calmed her down and made her promise we'd meet again soon. Now, tell me everything.
Bobby did so. Then Frankie said,
It fits in with what I've just seen. I found Nicholson holding Sylvia Bassington French's hands, and if the look he gave me could kill, I'd have been dead then and there. But why would Nicholson want to get rid of Alan Carstairs?
A large coincidence if Carstairs and Bassington French were in Marchbolt on the same day.
Well, coincidences do happen, but I don't see the motive. Was Carstairs on the track of Nicholson as the head of a drug-dealing gang? Or is Moira the motive for the murder?
It might be both, suggested Bobby. Nicholson might have known that Carstairs and Moira had talked, and he may have believed that his wife had betrayed his secrets.
That's a possibility, said Frankie. Now, the first thing to do is to talk to Roger Bassington French. If he can clear up the exchange of the photographs, it might be very valuable to have him on our side.
How do you mean, Frankie?
Bobby, if Moira's husband wants to get rid of her and marry Sylvia, then Henry Bassington French is in serious danger too. We've got to prevent him being sent to the Grange. And, at present, Roger Bassington French is on Nicholson's side.
Well thought of, Frankie, said Bobby quietly. Go ahead with your plan. Frankie got up to go.
Isn't it odd, she said. We seem somehow to have got in between the covers of a book. We're in the middle of someone else's story. It's a very strange feeling.
I know what you mean, said Bobby. But I would call it a play, rather than a book. It's as though we'd walked onto the stage in the middle of the play, and we haven't the slightest idea what the beginning was about. And what brought us into the show was a regular cue. 5 words, which are quite meaningless as far as we are concerned.
Why didn't they ask Evans? Isn't it odd, Bobby, that though we've found out a lot, and more characters have come into the thing, we never get any nearer to the mysterious Evans? Sometimes I don't believe there is an Evans.
Saying that, she went back towards the house. Chapter 21. Roger answers a question. Frankie found Roger in the garden.
There's something I want to ask you, she said immediately. Do you mind telling me if you took a photograph out of that man's pocket at Marchbolt?
She saw a look of slight annoyance on his face, but no guilt or worry. Now, how on earth did you guess that?
You did take it. Why?
Roger seemed embarrassed. Well, look at it as I did. Here I am, looking after a dead body. Something is sticking out of his pocket. The photograph of a woman I know, a married woman. What's going to happen? An inquest? Publicity? Possibly the poor girl's name in all the newspapers. I acted without thinking, took the photo and tore it up. I didn't want Moira to get into trouble.
Frankie took in a deep breath. But you should have told the police the man was Alan Carstairs. You must have recognized him.
I never saw his face. There was a handkerchief over it.
You never thought of looking? Asked Frankie.
No. Why should I?
How typical of a man, thought Frankie. A woman would certainly have looked. Then aloud she said, Sit down. I'm going to tell you a lot of things.
I think you must be right, he said when she had finished. Alan Carstairs was murdered. But I don't see why you see Nicholson as the criminal.
There are all the things Mrs. Nicholson told Bobby.
Roger frowned.
She may honestly believe he is trying to kill her, but is it true? She thinks he supplies Henry with the drug, but she has no evidence. She thinks he's in love with Sylvia. Well, lots of respectable men fall in love with other people's wives. No, it seems to me you're ignoring the real suspects, the Caymans.
So, you think Carstairs was carrying a photograph of Mrs. Cayman as well as Mrs. Nicholson's?
Roger nodded.
I think one was love and the other was business.
You're right, Frankie agreed. We ought to track the Caymans. But what about your brother? Do you still think he should go to the Grange?
No, said Roger, I don't. I think I'll ring up Nicholson. I'd like to have a talk with him.
He went quickly into the house as an aeroplane passed low overhead, filling the air with the sound of its loud engines. It disappeared over the trees, its noise lessening, and soon Roger came out again. He seemed slightly breathless.
Nicholson isn't in, he said. I left a message.
They sat down on the garden seat, and Roger agreed with Frankie that to tell the whole story to Sylvia would be a mistake. The best plan would be to question the doctor.
Henry mustn't go to the Grange, Roger said. You know, what's that?
They both jumped up. It sounded like a shot, said Frankie. They ran towards the house and went in by the glass doors of the drawing room. Sylvia was in the hall, her face white as paper.
Did you hear? She said. It was a shot from Henry's study.
Roger put an arm round her. Frankie went to the study door and turned the handle. It's locked, she said.
The window, said Roger.
He ran out again through the drawing room, Frankie at his heels. They ran round the house till they came to the study window. It was closed, and they could see Henry Bassington French lying across his desk. There was a bullet wound in his forehead, and a gun lay on the floor. He shot himself, said Frankie.
Stand back, said Roger. I'm going to break the window.
He took off his jacket and wrapped it round his hand, then smashed the glass. He and Frankie stepped into the room. As they did so, Sylvia and Dr. Nicholson came hurrying along the terrace.
Here's the doctor, said Sylvia. He's just arrived. I saw him coming up the drive.
Then she saw her husband and cried out. Roger stepped quickly out through the window, and Dr. Nicholson pushed Sylvia into his arms.
Take her away, he said. Look after her.
He stepped through the window and joined Frankie.
This is a terrible business, he said. Poor fellow.
He must have felt he couldn't give up his drugs. Too bad. Too bad. I wonder if he wrote something first. They usually do.
Frankie looked down at the desk. A piece of paper with a few words written on it lay at Bassington French's elbow. I feel this is the best way out. This dreadful habit has taken too great a hold on me for me to fight it now. I want to do the best I can for Sylvia and Tommy. God bless you both, my dears. Forgive me. Frankie felt suddenly sick. Chapter 22. Moira Disappears. Frankie rang Bobby an hour later and told him the news.
We must meet. I'll go for a walk before breakfast, say 8 o'clock, the same place we met today.
Bobby arrived first, but Frankie did not keep him waiting long. She looked pale and upset.
Hello, Bobby. It's so terrible. I haven't been able to sleep all night. I will have to leave today, of course. Sylvia's collapsed, poor woman.
Bobby nodded.
Is it quite certain that he did commit suicide? Moira said that Nicholson wanted 2 people out of the way, and here's one of them gone.
It must be suicide, Frankie said. The study door was locked, and so was the window. Roger had to smash it. It was only then that Nicholson appeared. Honestly, Bobby, Nicholson could not have killed Henry. Sylvia was in the house when the shot was fired, and she actually saw Nicholson coming up the drive. I hate to say it, but the man has an alibi.
I distrust people who have alibis, said Bobby. Well, what do we investigate next?
The Caymans. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And if Moira's right and Nicholson wants to marry Sylvia, Moira's life is in great danger. We must persuade her to leave the Grange at once.
Frankie nodded.
Bring the car round at 10:30. We'll drive straight to the Grange.
Frankie had never been to the Grange before, and the big iron gates and large dark green bushes depressed her.
It's a scary place, she observed.
They drove up to the front door, and Bobby got out of the car and rang the bell. A nurse opened the door.
Mrs. Nicholson?
Said Bobby. The woman opened the door wider. Frankie got out of the car and went into the house. She followed the nurse upstairs into a small sitting room decorated with bright curtains and many vases of flowers. The nurse went out, and 5 minutes later, Dr. Nicholson came in. Frankie hid the worry she felt with a welcoming smile and shook his hand.
Good morning, Lady Frances. You've not come to bring me bad news of Mrs. Bassington French, I hope?
She was still asleep when I left, said Frankie. I really called to see your wife.
That was very kind of you.
Was it only her imagination, or did the pale blue eyes show dislike?
I want to ask her to come to me in Marchbolt for a visit.
Frankie smiled again.
Why, that's really very kind of you, Lady Frances. I'm sure Moira would have enjoyed that very much.
Would have?
Asked Frankie sharply. Dr. Nicholson smiled.
Unfortunately, my wife went away this morning. This is rather a sad place for a young woman, Lady Frances. Occasionally, Moira feels she must have a little excitement.
You don't know where she has gone?
London, I imagine. Shoes and theatres, you know the sort of thing.
Frankie felt that his smile was the most unpleasant thing she had ever seen. Chapter 23. On the Track of the Caymans. Bobby had to work hard to keep his face from showing his feelings when he saw Frankie come out alone. He drove down the drive and out through the gates. Then he stopped the car.
"What's going on?" he asked.
Rather pale, Frankie replied, "Bobby, I don't like it. Nicholson says she's gone away."
"We should never have let her go back there yesterday."
"You don't think she's dead, do you?"
whispered Frankie in a shaky voice.
"No," said Bobby. "Her death would have to seem natural and accidental. No, I believe she's still at the Grange."
"Well," said Frankie, "what are we going to do?"
Bobby thought for a minute. "You'd better go back to London and go on with tracing the Caymans. I'll drive you, and then your chauffeur will disappear. I'll remove my moustache, then come back down here and get a room at Ambledeva. That's only 10 miles away, but it's unlikely that Roger will see me there and recognise me from Marchbolt. And if Moira's still in the Grange, I'll find her."
"Bobby, you will be careful."
"I will be. I promise, Frankie."
At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Frankie arrived at St Leonard's Gardens, Paddington. She stopped at number 17, where there were no Caymans, and a sign outside said that it was available to be rented. Frankie wrote down the house agent's address and set off. But the Caymans had left no forwarding address with the agent. Disappointed, Frankie bought a newspaper and read it on the tube to Piccadilly Circus. There was a paragraph about Sir John Milkington recovering after his accident aboard the Astradora, the famous yacht which had belonged to the late Mr. John Savage, the millionaire. Was it an unlucky boat? Asked the writer. Frankie frowned. Twice before she'd heard the name of John Savage, from Sylvia Bassington French when she was speaking of Alan Carstairs, and from Bobby when he was repeating the conversation he had had with Mrs. Rivington. Alan Carstairs had been a friend of John Savage's, and Savage had committed suicide because he thought he had cancer. Supposing Alan Carstairs had not been satisfied with the story of his friend's death, what if he had come over to investigate that death? Perhaps it was Savage's death that was the beginning of the play that she and Bobby were acting in. It's possible, thought Frankie. She had no idea who John Savage's friends had been. Then an idea came to her. His will. If there had been something suspicious about his death, his will might give her a clue. Frankie was received with a great deal of respect at Spragg, Jenkinson and Spragg, and was shown into the private office of Mr. Spragg, the senior member of the firm, who, it was said, knew more dark secrets about aristocratic families than any other man in London.
"Lady Frances," said Mr. Spragg, "do sit down. And what is it that gives me the pleasure of seeing you this afternoon?"
"I want to look at a will," said Frankie, "and I don't know where to go to see it."
"You go to Somerset House. All wills are stored there," said Mr. Spragg. "But I can tell you anything you want to know about the wills in your family."
"It isn't a family will," said Frankie. "I wanted to see the will of Mr. John Savage."
"Indeed?" Mr. Spragg looked worried. "Lady Frances, I would never want to involve you in anything that might be illegal, and there is something going on that worries me. I have been impersonated, Lady Frances, deliberately impersonated. What do you say to that?"
For a moment, Frankie, suddenly in panic, could say nothing at all. Then, "How did you find out?" she asked.
"Do you know something about this impersonation, Lady Frances?"
Frankie said weakly. "It was a joke."
"And who," demanded Mr. Spragg, "pretended to be me?"
Knowing his weakness for aristocratic names, Frankie said, "It was the young Duke of... No, I really mustn't mention names."
Mr. Spragg's kind manner returned. "Oh, you young people," he said, smiling and putting a letter into her hand. "There, see where your foolishness has led you into."
"Dear Mr. Spragg," Mrs. Rivington had written, "I've just remembered something that might have helped you the day you called on me. Alan Carstairs mentioned that he was going to a place called Chipping Somerton. With kind regards, Edith Rivington."
"I understood that there was some extremely questionable business," said Mr. Spragg, "with my client, Mr. Carstairs."
"Was Alan Carstairs a client of yours?" Frankie interrupted excitedly.
"He was. He came to me for advice when he was last in England."
"He came to ask you about Mr. Savage's will, didn't he?" said Frankie.
"Ah, it was you who advised him to come to me?"
"Would it be unprofessional of you to tell me your advice?" she asked, avoiding answering the question.
"Not in this case," said Mr. Spragg. "My opinion was that there was nothing that could be done."
"The whole thing was very strange," said Frankie, pushing gently. She felt as if she was walking barefoot over a floor covered with broken glass. At any minute she might step on a bit.
"Such cases are less uncommon than you might think," said Mr. Spragg.
"Cases of suicide?"
"No, cases of men being persuaded to do things they wouldn't usually do by a pretty girl. Mr. Savage was a hard-headed businessman, and yet he seems to have fallen completely under this woman's influence."
"I wish you'd tell me the whole story," said Frankie. "Mr. Carstairs was so angry when he spoke of it that I never understood it clearly."
Mr. Savage was extremely wealthy. On a voyage back from the United States, he met a Mrs. Templeton.
Mr. Spragg shook his head sadly.
Mr. Savage was very much attracted to her. He accepted the lady's invitation to stay at her cottage at Chipping Somerton, where he came more and more under her spell. Then came the tragedy. Mr. Savage had, for some time, been uneasy about his health. He feared he might be suffering from cancer. It became an obsession. The Templetons persuaded him to go up to London and see a specialist. He did so. Now, Lady Frances, that specialist, a highly respected doctor, swore at the inquest that Mr. Savage was not suffering from cancer, but that Mr. Savage was so obsessed by his own belief that he could not accept the truth when he was told it. Anyway, Mr. Savage went back to Chipping Somerton in a state of great sadness. He saw ahead of him a painful and slow death, and he was determined not to go through it. He sent for a lawyer and made a will, which he signed. That same evening, Mr. Savage took a very large dose of a sleeping drug, leaving a letter in which he said he preferred a quick and painless death to a long and painful one. And by his will, Mr. Savage left £700,000 to Mrs. Templeton and the rest to charities.
Mr. Spragg leaned back in his chair.
The jury brought in the verdict of suicide while of unsound mind, but the will was made in the presence of a lawyer who believed that Savage was of sound mind.
Mr. Spragg paused.
Mr. Carstairs, however, believed that such a will was completely against Mr. Savage's beliefs. He disliked organised charities and held very strong opinions that money should be left to blood relatives. However, Mr. Carstairs had no written proof of these beliefs, and Mr. Savage's only relatives were distant cousins in Australia, without the money to challenge the will.
"I see," said Frankie. "Is anything known about this Mrs. Templeton?" Mr. Spragg shook his head. Nothing, except that she was very beautiful. A man like Mr. Savage ought not to have been deceived, but— Mr. Spragg shook his head as the faces of many clients who ought to have known better passed across his mind. Frankie rose. "Men are extraordinary creatures," she said.